received an email the other day, apparently from one of Jehovah's Witnesses, asking why I was campaigning against Jehovah's Witnesses. I explained to them briefly that I wasn't campaigning against Jehovah's Witnesses, but rather against a fraud that's being perpetrated against Jehovah's Witnesses by the leadership of the Watchtower. Now, of course, face value, Jehovah's Witnesses would brush that off. Oh, that's crazy. That's nonsense. That's the faithful slave. The governing body is appointed by God. That's his earthly channel, so forth. And I don't dispute that, actually. But according to the prophecies of the Bible, there is an evil element within Christ's congregation up until the manifestation of Jesus eliminates it. For example, if you read in the book of Revelation, Jesus gave 7 messages to the 7 congregations. And of course, those were literal congregations in the first century, Ephesus and Philadelphia and Smyrna and Thyatira, so on. But they're really symbolic congregations that would exist representing all of those who are anointed during the time of Christ's presence, during the Lord's day. That's what Revelation is all about, a revealing of God's judgments. And within some of those congregations, there are evil persons who exert a misleading influence upon others. For example, there is the sect of Nicolaus, whom Jesus said he hated. And then there is this person called Jezebel, and also Balaam. If you recall in the Hebrew text, Balaam was actually a person who had a relationship with Jehovah outside of Israel. God spoke to him on a couple of occasions. And yet when the Israelites were ready to come into the promised land, he was willing to sell them out, so to speak, to their enemy, King Balak. So here this character is within Christ's congregation, exerting, obviously, an evil influence. Actually, the Watchtower has inadvertently admitted this to be the case. Because for many years, as Jehovah's Witnesses well know, the Watchtower taught that Christ appointed a faithful slave over all of his belongings and expelled an evil slave back in 1918 or 1919. But as of last year, 2013, the Watchtower said, no, that's not true. There are 2 appointments. The master has appointed his slave to feed the domestics, but then there's another appointment when the master unexpectedly arrives as a thief in the night. And if the slave is doing his job as the master expects, then he will appoint him over all of his belongings. And now the Watchtower says that hasn't happened. And of course that's true. I wrote about that back in 2005, and Jehovah himself has become king. I don't know if that's why they revised their idea, it doesn't matter. But the point is, when Christ comes as a thief for this inspection, there is an evil slave and one whom Christ considers faithful, even though he punishes both. One with a few strokes and the other with many strokes, with the greatest of severity, and he's put out. So this means there is an evil presence, an evil slave yet to be condemned and put out by Christ. And that's what is revealed in the book of Revelation as well. But as regards Revelation, the Watchtower says that those 7 congregations represent Christendom. And yet at the same time, they say that Christ separated his anointed his Bible students from Christendom back in 1918. So how could that be the case, that we're in the Lord's day since 1914, and yet Jesus is still dealing with Christendom? So that is an example of the sort of untruth, trickiness that is characteristic of the way the Watchtower interprets prophecy. And that is what I am opposed to and dedicated to exposing, you might say. the purpose is God allows this deluding influence to exist to influence those who know the truth for the purpose of setting up a test of their faith. Everyone's faith will be tested, especially when you consider that Jehovah is going to give the new heavens and the new earth to the faithful. But they have to pass a test, just as the apostles had to pass a test. You recall that Jesus told Peter that Satan had demanded to have them to sift him as wheat. And that was on the very night that Jesus was arrested. And of course, the apostles were all stumbled and scattered, and that was their test, because Jehovah had concealed from them the truth about Christ's death and resurrection. Even though Jesus explained to them many times, it says that it had been concealed from them that they might not see through it. And the prophecies indicate that God's people, leading up to the actual presence of Jesus, would be blind and deceived. And many will be stumbled when Christ's presence actually commences, because they will refuse to relinquish this idea that Jesus has been present since 1914. As an example of the untruth that emanates from the leadership of the Watchtower, they just published this year, 2014, at the conventions, a new book, I suppose, to replace the book written some time ago. It's an encyclopedic history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose, I suppose. Oh no, the Proclaimer's book, that's it. But the new publication is somewhat more concise. It's entitled God's Kingdom Rules. And it's really celebrating that Jesus has been ruling since 1914. And someone sent me a PDF of it. I haven't read all of it, but the little bit that I read the other day, they say that the Bible students had been expecting Jesus' presence to begin in 1914. And lo and behold, boom, the sign of his presence was there with World War and so forth. But I think many of Jehovah's Witnesses, at least they should know, that that is absolutely untrue. The Bible students were not expecting the presence of Jesus to begin in 1914. They believed that the presence had already begun. In fact, Russell taught that the parousia, the presence of Jesus, began in 1874. That's the year that he formed his Bible student group. So apparently they thought that the presence had maneuvered their gathering together and understanding these basic doctrines. It wasn't until around 1929 or 1930, I believe, that Rutherford reset it and said, no, the parousia did not begin in 1874, it began in 1914. And surely the governing body, the writing committee, knows that to be true. But they have no regard for the truth, apparently. They're so attached to this 1914 thing that they're willing to make a blatant, dishonest statement such as that. And you'd think they'd learn their lesson. I mean, so many outsiders and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses pounce upon these things to show how untrue the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses is. And I have to agree with them. But it's for a reason. And as I've written about on my website and in the book, the prophecies speak to that. For example, the book of Zephaniah. Now, of course, it was written leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, but it's really speaking about the day of Jehovah, the ultimate day of Jehovah, which is initiated with the coming of Christ. And of course, it says, before that day comes upon you, seek Jehovah, seek meekness, seek righteousness. Perhaps you will be concealed in the day of Jehovah's anger. Well, in the third chapter, it sort of reiterates that warning. It says, keep in expectation of me. until the day of my rising up to the prize, to the booty. For my judicial decision is to pour my rage out upon nations. And what's it say? And then I shall give to the peoples a change to a pure language, that they may all serve me shoulder to shoulder. Well, the Watchtower says that that pure language is spoken now by Jehovah's Witnesses. Even though anyone with a marginal reading ability can read that, and you have to come to the conclusion that the change to a pure language comes when Jehovah pours out his judgment upon the nations as a prelude to Armageddon. Yet the Watchtower says, no, Jehovah's, we all believe the same thing, we speak in unity. Well, organizational uniformity is not the same thing as the pure language. But if you read on down, Jehovah says, and no more will there be found in you your haughtily exultant one. That speaks to the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses who have exalted themselves. And it goes on to say that Jehovah will leave a people lowly and humble, and there will no more be any unrighteousness within his people, and no more will they speak with a tricky tongue. And boy, does that explain the way the Watchtower deals with these prophecies, all to convince Jehovah's Witnesses that Christ came in 1914 and all of that. Another prophecy that's quite relevant is, all of Isaiah really, but the 28th chapter of Isaiah speaks of the leaders of God's people who would be ruling over them when God lays as his foundation stone in Zion this tested stone. In other words, Christ's kingdom. And the leaders of God's people at that moment, when this tried and tested stone is established, they're concealing themselves in a lie. They claim to have made a covenant with death, and that God's judgment will not overreach them. But God says it will flood them out. The hail will sweep away your refuge of a lie. And that's exactly what 1914 is. It is a lie. Christ's coming is in the future. Even this, their adjustment now with this faithful slave being appointed. That occurs when Christ comes as a thief in the night. I think it was the July 2013 Watchtower. It made this adjustment, as they call it, that the faithful slave has not been appointed. In that same article, same magazine, they also reset a number of other parables. All of the parables that Jesus gave in the 25th chapter of Matthew regarding the wise and foolish virgins, just a tiny little reference made that, we used to think this occurred, but it hasn't yet. And also the slaves being called to account. So, in effect, the Watchtower has admitted that they are asleep. They're saying that the wise and foolish virgins yet have not gone out to meet the bridegroom. And yet in Jesus' parable, all 10 of the virgins, the wise and the foolish, nod off in the middle of the night while they're waiting for the bridegroom. And the call comes, here is the bridegroom, go out to meet him. And they rouse themselves. So they used to say that happened in 1918, the call came and blah, blah, blah. And now that's no more. But you can't blame Jehovah's Witnesses for not realizing that, because they devoted like an entire sentence to doing away with that entire theology, if you want to call it that. So here we are now, coming up on the 100th anniversary of when C.T. Russell came down to the dining hall in Bethel and announced, the Gentile times have ended, their kings have had their day. That was October 2nd, 1914. And then the Great War began. Actually, it began in August, but it's kind of a non-war for some months. And we've had another war since then, haven't we? World War II. But we're on the verge of another war. And many people can see that it's been developing for some time. And in some respects, the Third World War has already begun. Every war begins differently. And this war apparently has begun with the Anglo-American world power using these surrogates. They've got the Nazis set up in Ukraine, pushing Russia, provoking Russia's border. They're using this new terrorist group, ISIS, in Syria and now in Iraq. Supposedly they just broke into a hospital a few days ago and stole some uranium. So now they've got something for a dirty bomb, I suppose. But all of this is happening against the backdrop of a new monetary system that's being set up. In fact, this week, the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have formed this alliance. Other countries are welcome. Argentina may join. But they represent a very large segment of humanity and quite a bit of wealth. And at this recent meeting, they have established a developmental bank to replace the IMF and the World Bank, which were established in the aftermath of World War II and have really been used by the empire to crush and defraud nations. Because once they borrow money from the IMF, then they come in with their conditionalities and override national sovereignty and tell them what they can and can't do within their own country. No, you can't develop this, you can't develop that. You've got to pay the interest on your debt. We don't want you building dams and roads, and you'll mess up the ecology. And so they've kept, particularly third world countries, in a third world state. But now China, with their trillions of dollars of reserve, and Russia, with their vast oil and gas supplies, they are in a controlling position. But we know from prophecy that the empire has resided in Europe since really going back to Alexander, and then through the Roman Empire, and now London is really the seat of the empire. They've co-opted the United States and used its vast resources to further their aims. But anyway, we have these two opposing blocks now. And I read one commentary the other day that said that with this new BRICS developmental bank, he gives the dollar about 2 years before it is completely. But they're not going to let that happen. They're not going to go down without a fight, and they can bring it. So we're coming up on a massive war and a huge upheaval. And the Watchtower is celebrating their 1914 centennial. Now, the question I pose for Jehovah's Witnesses, when the bombs start flying, do you think the Watchtower is going to announce that they were wrong about 1914? Either way, I seriously doubt it. But it will create a huge dilemma, because the obvious implication of another world war is, and all the things that follow, food shortage, pestilence, it will be obvious that the presence of Christ has really begun, not a continuation of a presence that began 100 years ago. And it's interesting, though, when you read the gospel of Jesus was talking about the conclusion and the sign of his presence, one of the things he emphasized the most was the deception that would be concurrent with his presence. Look out that no one misleads you, he said on several occasions. Many will come in my name, saying, I'm the Christ, or here's the Christ in the wilderness. There he is, he's in the inner chambers. Don't believe it. Don't go out. Jesus said that the deception would be so thorough that if possible, it could deceive even the chosen ones. Now imagine that. Jehovah's Witnesses are no part of Christendom. They give no heed to any clergyman or pastor or what have you. But they do believe that the Watchtower is God's spokesman. And they're required to believe whatever comes through the pages of the Watchtower out of the mouth of the slave. And, the Watchtower is really setting you up, because a recent Watchtower said, well, if you receive life-saving instructions through the Watchtower, it may not seem practical at the time, but you're required to believe it. These instructions are as if Jehovah is speaking to you. Look out that nobody misleads you. Many will come on the basis of my name, saying, I am he. Here's the Christ in the wilderness, in Bethel, in its inner sanctum. But we'll see what happens in the days going forward, won't we? This is just my little voice in the wilderness imitation here. Thanks for watching.